So, welcome back to the Athletes Edge podcast. Today's topic is a bit of a divisive one around the effectiveness of ice baths, and there has been some more research articles around the common use of ice baths. So, can you walk us through that and explain your point of view?
Beautiful. I think for me, ice baths have long been believed to help with things like reducing soreness, pain, some swelling, decreasing fatigue, so helping athletes recover quicker, improving next day performance or 2 days later performance, so that you can potentially get more frequent training in. What we're starting to see now with certain research is a lot of that being questioned. So that there's two probably main reviews and bits of research that have come out. One being showing that post-resistance training, that the ability for the body to adapt through inflammation was essentially blunted to a degree. So it starts to question, when should we do ice baths? Because if we do it after gym session, we may actually blunt the point of that gym session, trying to build more muscle and get stronger. So if we blunt that adaptation, then we get less muscle growth, and therefore we're not going to get the same strength improvements off the back of it. More recently, a research group looked at the ability for athletes to recover from a performance point of view, and actually showed that compared to just passive rest, so doing nothing as a form of recovery, that the results were very similar one day after. So it starts to show that if we're doing ice baths, cold water immersion for the reason of returning performance the next day to a certain level, then maybe it's not what it's all cracked up to be.
So, in your opinion, what is the goal of an ice bath?
For me, I'm more looking at ice baths in and around mitigating some of the real soreness risk. So for me, it potentially at specific times of the year or after specific sessions, particularly in congested schedules. So where there might be games or lots of training condensed right in, then potentially I could see a benefit for it. But the problem there is that's not most of the sports, in my opinion, that we deal with. So sports that work on a weekly cycle, so you play one game a weekend, I'm starting to think, well, are there other forms of recovery we could be using that are actually more beneficial than going to the ice? Because in my experience, no one really enjoys them. I think most people do them because they think they're good for you and they should. And that's what I think we're starting to question is, are they actually doing anything for you? Potentially not. And in some instances, actually doing more harm than good, no doubt.
So you touched on it there, but what are some alternative options, for recovery post-game or post-training instead of an ice bath?
To me, what are you trying to recover from? What are the results you're trying to get? The main things we know with recovery, the things that have got the most research and the most effectiveness are getting your sleep, which a lot of athletes don't get. The nutrition stuff, 80% in my experience don't get that right. So what's an ice bath going to do if that's not done correctly? So making sure you get your sleep and your nutrition right, and that's pre and post. And then in with your hydration. So again, a lot of athletes are dehydrated, even in a mild form, to fairly significant dehydration pre-event, and then they're looking at obviously more water loss during training and games. Even we're seeing ice baths on the flip side, sauna. So really common now, post-training, post-game sauna as well. If you're dehydrated, is getting in the hot room for half an hour a good decision? Probably not. So just potentially more fluid loss. So again, it comes back to, what are we trying to recover from? What are our goals? What's the cost of what we just did? So what do we need to replace to ensure that we adapt? Because training in itself isn't what creates the adaptation. It's the recovery, it's the period, the 24, 48 hours after that session is where we actually see the results. So if you do the session and then don't get the next bit right and just do whatever you think you should be doing is the right thing and not actually giving it any specific thought and planning, then potentially you're leaving a lot of results on the table.
That's where I think a lot of local athletes, from my experience, do tend to make the mistake of ice bath is probably number one, as in, so I've ticked that box, or I've done a sauna, I've done a flush run, all sort of great, get you moving and whatnot, but they neglect the most important part, which you alluded to, is the nutrition, the hydration, and all that kind of stuff. So a lot of it is they might be eating a bit of junk food on Saturday because they felt like they've earned it, or maybe getting on the piss, or whatever that looks like. So why do athletes have such a misunderstanding when it comes to recovery?
I don't know if it's necessarily a misunderstanding. I think a lot of it is we're lazy and what's easiest. Is it easy just to go stand in the river for 10 minutes or do meal prep for 7 days? Is it go have a sauna versus go for a walk, get a stretching session in, maybe do a bit of like yoga, meditation, which arguably is going to be a lot better for you. So I think we're drawn to the fads, what's easy, what's popular, what we can share. I don't see too many young athletes sharing meal prep on social media, but they're all happy sharing saunas and ice baths and whatnot. So I think it's about what's cool and what everyone else is doing as opposed to what we know really works. And I know performance centers and stuff that have installed ice baths and all this sort of stuff just to go, it just wasn't worth the investment and remove them all. So to me, it comes down to what the session you're doing, get the big rocks sorted. Like we said, nutrition, sleep, hydration. The mindfulness stuff probably is the next big rock in and around how you reflect on the game, not stressing on things like basically stress management. And then after that, I think things like ice baths, saunas, compression, active recovery, foam rollers, stretching, all that sort of stuff then comes down to what symptoms am I essentially trying to manage here. So for example, if I'm really stiff post-game, then that's when I'm looking at some movement, some massage, potentially some hot cold, that sort of stuff to try and get me moving. So I've got a really specific goal there. I'm not just jumping in doing any of those for no reason. If I'm really heavy legs, then I'm making sure things like it's probably a muscle issue. So making sure protein is a focus in my nutrition recovery. And then again, maybe some cold water immersion. So some ice baths, some BFR, that sort of stuff, and some compression boots, because that's more targeted towards the soreness and the heavy legs. If it's more tired, irritable, cranky, that sort of stuff, well, then I'm probably looking at the sleep we're looking at that anyway, but really drilling down on sleep, meditation, yoga, all that stuff, because essentially that's the problem. So it comes back to how do I tick off the big rocks, and then from there, don't use these, like you said, ice baths as one of the smaller tools as the mainstay for your recovery, because there'll be a lot you're not doing well, and it's probably not giving you the results you expect.
And so you raised it off air, but when you mentioned around, obviously, that there's an adaptation that you experience off the back of every training session.
Yep.
And so for athletes who don't really train much in season, when they have an ice bath after a game,
Yep.
it actually kind of ruins that adaptation.
If you're not a big trainer during the week, so you're not doing a lot in the gym and you Tuesday, and this is my experience, most athletes are just sort of going through the motions during the week. We can, I think, all relate to when we've played a few games, whether that's whatever your sport is, you start to get a bit game fit, that match fitness, you start to feel better as a result of the game. So my argument with that and the discussion we're having is, if you then ice bath after every game, in theory, the game is your biggest training stimulus for the week. If you're not training really hard in a day or two's time that you need to get up for, and potentially some of that soreness management where maybe ice bath has some benefit, then what's really the point? Because you may be actually blunting the adaptation from the main training stimulus you have for that week, if that makes sense. So to me, it's if we know that the ice bath can have a negative effect and that's your one big session for the week, to me, you need to optimize everything else to actually boost the adaptation from that, not try and blunt it just so you feel better on Sunday morning when we're trying to get better for the next weekend.